Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Spring 2024 Meet the Fellows program at the Cogut Institute for the Humanities. I'm Peter Szendy, David Hurley Professor of Comparative Literature and Humanities at Brown. I am leading this year's Cogut seminar, where the fellows hosted by the Institute come together every week to share and discuss their work in progress. The Cogut Institute Fellows are scholars at all stages of their career, faculty, undergraduates, doctoral candidates, and postdocs, scholars who represent various disciplines across the humanities and the humanistic social sciences. They pursue individual research projects over the course of the year. This evening's event, with a short presentation by each fellow, is an opportunity to get a glimpse of the ongoing work in the humanities at Brown. The Fellows Program is made possible through the generous support of many. Thanks are due in particular to the Mellon Foundation for helping the Cogut Institute to create endowed funds for postdoctoral fellowships, graduate research, and the Collaborative Humanities Initiative. We also thank the many individual donors who have helped the Institute to sustain and, in some cases, endow its programs and initiatives. As we move into the talks, I'll introduce the speakers in small groups, and I would like to invite you to think about how the talks echo one another, either by revealing shared methodologies or concerns, or by shedding an unexpected light on each other's assumptions, aims, or findings. Our second speaker will be Grace Xiao, an undergraduate concentrating in history of art and architecture. Grace's senior thesis focuses on women artists of the South Asian diaspora. In her talk, you will see photographs by Zarina Bimji, a photographer born in Uganda within the Asian community. Grace's work pays attention to how artists are undermining the uses of photography as a violent tool for coloniality. And our third speaker, Goutam Piduri, is a sixth-year doctoral candidate in the Department of English. He investigates forms of non-possession, indifference to material goods, and how these forms might be paradoxically allied to imperialist thought. His dissertation seeks to complicate the simplistic claim that ascetic renunciation amounts to resistance to imperialism.
My name is Grace Xiao. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently an undergraduate fellow with the Cogut Institute, concentrating in the history of art and architecture. This evening, I'll be presenting a brief overview of my senior honors thesis, tentatively titled Dislocation, Diaspora, and the Camera Image, Zarina Bimji in 1980s Afro-Asian Britain. So my project takes up contemporary lens-based artist Zarina Bimji's untitled series of 10 large format Polaroid photographs taken in 1989 during a 2-day residency at the Victoria and Albert Museum, or the V&A. Before I fully dive into my project, I want to begin by sharing an experience I had while conducting research that will hopefully set up a framework for what I aim to accomplish in my thesis. In late August of last year, I found myself in London on a travel grant, primarily conducting research at the V&A and its archives. On one of those days, I went to the Young V&A, the V&A's Children's Museum, because I knew that one of the photographs from Bimji's series was on view there for a section of the museum on self-portraiture. The image that I expected to counter is what I have here displayed on the right side of the screen. However, when I eventually found the photograph, this is what I actually encountered. So this image that, due to glare and reflected light, was barely visible. So if you've ever seen a dark photograph hung up in a museum with glazing in front of it, then you can understand my frustration with this setup. In order to get a proper view of the image, I had to orient my body to the side of the work, and even then it was difficult to make out all the sharp details. What was I demanding from the work, and how did my difficulty in accessing this photograph in the space of the museum illuminate questions surrounding my expectations of visibility from the museum as an institution, from photography as a medium, and from the South Asian femme body in this work specifically? So this question of visibility, as it relates both to questions of identity and to the specificities of the medium of photography, stood at the core of my research project. I ask, given photography's ties to histories of colonialism, in this case the specificities of the British project in South Asia, is it possible for colonized bodies and peoples to reclaim the camera image? And within this project, and for third world women specifically, to what extent is visibility dangerous, and to what extent is visibility productive? Bimji's series engages with the various collections of the V&A while also inserting objects tied to her personal history and at times her own body. Through her work, I examine photography's historical and continued use as a violent tool for coloniality in South Asia, pointing to how Bimji engages with this genealogy and seeks to undermine it, perhaps even counterintuitively by working within the language of the camera lens. Photography's fraught claim to objectivity comes in its ability to package stories within the neat boundaries of a frame, and because of this, it proved effective in aiding the British colonial state's reduction of South Asian peoples to visual spectacle and objects to be surveilled. And yet Bimji manages to undermine this apparent completeness, infallibility, and objectivity of the camera, instead asserting the fluidity and instability of subjectivity and foregrounding a refusal of full visibility. When I see Bimji's work, I see moments of ambiguity, difficulty, and inscrutability, not in the negative, but as generative modes that challenge the ease and transparency of the photograph in order to think through power, politics, and visibility. Her work, I suggest, proposes a new way of engaging with photography that detaches the medium from its perceived purely optical nature. So while Bimji is perhaps most known for her video work from the early 2000s, I situate her as an artist emerging from the 1980s, which saw the simultaneous establishment of the British Black arts movement and the growth of third world feminist movements across the global South and its diasporas. The British Black arts movement brought with it new understandings of diasporic cultural production, crafting a British identity outside of whiteness that included Afro-Asian political identities. And third world feminist movements during this time began diverging from white hegemonic understandings of feminism, seeking to center the specific experiences of women of color and to build solidarity transnationally throughout the global South. Taking the lead from this historical moment, I utilized Bimji's work as a way to bring closer a third world feminist critique of power and agency and a diasporic critique of essentialized identities, particularly as they both relate to the camera image, navigating questions about identity and representation that still remain in contention today. Thank you.
Hello, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to start today with an unlikely conjuration, simply because it's been on my mind recently, and so I hope you will forgive me if I seem insensitive in any way. Sometime between 2014 and 2021, rumors started to proliferate on the internet about the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's work schedule. These reports shared that the right-wing ultra-nationalist prime minister would forego sleep, food, and other material needs in order to serve the Indian people. Such descriptions of Modi, along with a beard that keeps increasing in length, have given him a kind of spiritual aura that can at least be described as authoritative, if not authoritarian. What does it mean to cultivate such a position, one in which material objects, even those as basic as food and shelter, are given up in an attempt to attain an otherworldly spiritual authority? My project, Owning Renunciation, gives this cultivation the name non-possession. A translation of the Sanskrit term aparigraha, which is usually rendered as the virtue of non-attachment, the term non-possession is my way of getting at the cultivation of indifference to material objects as a discursive mechanism of gaining authority. We are used to thinking of the violence of empire as one beholden to acquisition and appropriation. My project looks to early incarnations of English colonial discourse to think about how acquisition might not be the only mechanism by which such violence discursively manifests. Indeed, what I have found in 17th century texts in England, South Asia, and North America is the creation of colonial, racial, and religious differences that have at their core an articulation of non-possession. In these texts, non-possession is not the prerogative of the monk who laughs at an invading king, who we might use as a figure that speaks truth to authority. Rather, it is the mechanism by which civilizational difference is articulated. We, colonizers, have the virtuous ability to give stuff up. You do not. My example today is one from Roger Williams' Key into the Language of America, printed in 1643. It's a lexicon of words supposedly spoken by the Native Americans inhabiting the land on which many of us stand right now, New England. The key is often studied for its examples of what could be called Western self-critique, in which Williams takes his fellow Englishmen to task for their degenerate ways. After translating a list of terms that have to do with currency and transactions, Williams adds the poem you see here. The Indians prize not English gold, nor English Indians shell, their currency, and later on, English and Indians all pass hence, to an eternal place, a place, he says, where naught's worth aught but grace. Williams forwards his authority here based on an equation between the non-virtuous English, who know of spiritual wealth but throw it away in favor of gold, and the indigenous figure who is attached to their currency because they don't know of spiritual wealth. This economically articulated virtue forwards some kind of equality in which we might want to derive some critique of empire, but it is deprived of its oppositional character precisely because it hinges on the virtues of non-possession. These virtues give New England colonists a spiritual authority over indigenous people and over the degenerates of Old England. It is the cultivation of these virtues through indifference that settler colonial authorities use to separate themselves from those who are deemed lacking in the ability to cultivate them. Whether in a settler colonial missionary or settler colonial prime minister, non-possession becomes a technology of empire, even as it announces its indifference to acquisition. Thank you for your time and attention today.
Thank you so much, Faiz, Grace, and Goutam, for opening our event with these fascinating perspectives and counter-perspectives on empires and coloniality. Let's turn to our next pair of talks. Christopher Grasso is professor in the Department of History. He's the author of 4 acclaimed books on aristocracy and public discourse in 18th century Connecticut, on skepticism and faith from the Revolution to the Civil War, and on the 19th century American politician John Kelso. His current research project delves into the archives of the Chisolm Massacre, a lynching in Mississippi in 1877. After Chris, we will hear Katherine Mason, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology and a medical anthropologist of China and the United States. She is the author of a book titled Infectious Change, based on fieldwork in China after the SARS epidemic. Kate's talk will focus on the pandemic journaling project, of which she is the co-founder. It is a multidisciplinary effort to build a diverse archive of the COVID pandemic. Let's start with Chris.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks, everyone. My project began with a privately held archive. A Rhode Island man had inherited a couple trunks filled with 1,500 items, packets of 19th century letters and newspapers and other paraphernalia, most of which were related to an event that had occurred to his ancestors, the Chisholms, in Kemper County, Mississippi, on April 29th, 1877. The episode came to be called the Chisholm Massacre because on that day, a mob killed William Wallace Chisholm, 2 of his children, and 2 other men. Chisholm was the leading Republican in the county, having served in the Reconstruction era as a judge and a sheriff, and having run for Congress in 1876. Just weeks before Chisholm was killed, he had testified before a congressional committee about election irregularities. A few days before the mob attacked, someone shot and killed the county's leading Democrat and Chisholm's personal enemy. That man's family and their friends were convinced that Chisholm had something to do with the murder. So they had Chisholm and 4 other Republicans arrested. Fearing for his safety, Chisholm's entire family accompanied him to the jail. The mob attacked the jail later that day. The murders quickly became national news in the wake of a contested presidential election and with the fate of Reconstruction in the South uncertain. 2 books were published, one from the Republican and one from the Democratic perspective. Both books claim to be histories, fair and balanced accounts adhering to the facts collected from public documents and interviews with eyewitnesses. My first thought after reading these was that they might be interesting to bring into the classroom in our own era of fake news and alternate facts and cable channels presenting starkly different political realities. Not, I want to be clear, as an exercise of both sidesism, but as a way of examining how historians determine that one account of the past is better than another, In other words, I want to tell the story or the stories of the Chisolm massacre and also make the practice of historical interpretation more transparent and surface the epistemological issues that lurk behind historical work. The project will be a born digital book with 5 chapters. Each of the first 4 chapters focuses on a different character and point of view as it carries the narrative forward chronologically. Chapter 1 centers on the book that I just mentioned that's written from the Republican perspective. Chapter 2 on the Southern Democratic answer. Chapter 3 takes us through the events of April 29th, 1877, and then to the 2 subsequent murder trials. The central character here is Emily Chisolm, the judge's wife, who wrote a 16,000-word recollection of the events of that day. The 4th chapter, and the one I'll be sharing with the seminar, focuses on the Black people who were pushed to the margins in these other narratives. And the 5th chapter is about the relationship of history and memory. As I said, this is a digital project, and I imagine that I will have the text proper, the multi-perspective narrative that I've described, appearing on the left side of the screen, and then materials will pop up or emerge on the right side, placed in dialogue with that text. For example, images and objects with brief commentary, primary sources and primary source clusters, excerpts from secondary sources, and also mini essays on related topics. The purpose of all this would be to deepen and enrich the discussion of the main text, to present the evidence on which many of the claims in the text are based, and to unpack the reasoning behind interpretive judgments. And then finally, to promote a kind of meta-historical reflection. Thank you.
Thank you. Share my screen. Thank you very much for your introduction, Peter. And I see now why I was placed in the session with Chris, because we're thinking about some of the same things from rather different angles. So let me actually set this presentation view. Okay. So I'm going to be talking briefly today about the Pandemic Journaling Project, which is something I've been working on for about 4 years now, but I'm more intensively working on it during my leave this year. And just give a brief introduction. So this is a project that a colleague of mine at UConn, Sarah Willen, and I founded back in May 2020. And it was an effort to what we referred to as pre-design an archive of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're anthropologists. We couldn't do our usual anthropology thing that one does. I am a scholar of epidemics, so my instinct was to go out and talk to people and observe what was going on. But like everyone else, I was stuck inside hoarding my toilet paper. So we had to come up with some alternative methods. This was a project that ran online for a full 2 years. There are some additional sub-projects going on right now, but the main project I'm referring to today ran from May 2020 to May 2022, and we collected more than 27,000 journal entries from almost 2,000 participants around the world. And what it was anyone who wanted to join could. They would take a brief baseline survey and then would be invited to record 2 journal entries digitally each week for up to 2 years, depending on how long they choose to participate. And in response, they could write an answer, they could record their voice and upload that voice recording, or they could take a photograph and talk about that photograph. And we wanted to make this as accessible as possible. So we wanted to make sure that it was compatible with smartphones, so no one needed a computer to do this. That it was anonymous so that people could feel comfortable talking about personal matters. And it was also a bilingual English-Spanish platform. Other people could record their responses in any language. And I don't have time to show you this video, but this is on our website. If you just Google Pandemic Journaling Project, it provides an overview of some of the audio recording that we gathered to get a sense of people's experiences. So what we were trying to do, first of all, as I mentioned, necessity is the mother of invention. We couldn't do our usual ethnography things, so we were trying to gather information in other ways. But we also had two other really important goals here. One was a mental health goal. So there's a lot of evidence that journaling provides some therapeutic benefits. So we saw it as a bit of a public service. My colleague and I both study mental health as one of the things we work on. So that was something of interest to us. And also of perhaps more interest to the Cogut community, we are really interested in pre-designing an archive, as I mentioned earlier. And we really wanted to focus on making sure that when the story of COVID is written in the future, that people often left out of historical records are able to be included. And we worked with historian colleagues from really early on to do this. So the methodology we kind of developed out of this, we're calling Grassroots Collaborative Ethnography, which again, as I mentioned, is trying to decenter elite voices in historical records through what's called archival activism. That's not our term, but it's something we're really interested in. But also a new way of thinking about how to create knowledge and collect data as anthropologists. We really emphasize giving participants a lot of accessibility and also choice in when, how, and whether to participate. We wanted to make sure they were getting a benefit out of this, including the mental health benefit we mentioned, which of course we couldn't guarantee, but some people found did occur. And also the ability to build a personal family archive so they could download at any time all of their journal entries from their participation and keep it for their families. And then finally, we were nurturing a team-based community engaged kind of participatory project with students, colleagues, and participants who worked with us to present material and interpret it. So just as a PSA, this is all going to be available to other scholars beginning 2 weeks from today, which is really exciting, with the qualitative data repository. And I'll just really briefly mention some of the things we've been doing with this material. Last year, we had an international photo exhibition that went up there. You can still find some elements of it at Brown. This is just an example of one of the more popular photos that appeared in just about all the exhibitions of a 4-year-old expressing their feelings about the pandemic, which I think is kind of brilliant. This just mentions some of our ongoing projects, but what I want to just end with really quickly is some of the things that I've been really interested in thinking about with regards to what kind of material it is that we have. So one of the really interesting questions for us was why people would actually do this. We weren't offering any monetary compensation for this initial project. And so people just decided they wanted to do it because of a variety of reasons that we're trying to understand. And these are some of them we're thinking about now, what people were doing this for. And then also some of the things people were working out in their journals in real time, especially with regards to their own moral status and that of those around them and how they thought history was going to judge them. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Chris and Kate, for this vividly contrasting diptych on the archive of violent death on the one hand, and on archiving silent spreading on the other hand. Next, we have another pair of talks, another contrasting diptych on belonging, identity, and becoming. Devon Clifton is a 6th-year doctoral candidate in the Department of English. Her dissertation, titled Psychoanalytics Towards a Black Object Study, builds on the theory of object relations to examine African-American literature and literary criticism. Using the work of Hortense Spillers and Donald Winnicott, Devon offers close readings of major literary texts by African-American women, like Passing, the novel by Nella Larsen. Then Jessaca Leinaweaver, who is professor of anthropology. She's the author of 2 books, both translated in Spanish: The Circulation of Children, Adoption, Kinship, and Morality in Andean Peru, and Adoptive Migration, Raising Latinos in Spain. She has a co-authored book forthcoming in October, Care and Agency, The Andean Community Through the Eyes of Children. Jessaca's current research focuses on residential care for children, what used to be called orphanages. Let's start with Devon.
I have this foundational quote within Black Studies from Frantz Fanon's Black Skins, White Masks beside me, because it captures what my project argues is a formative site of difficulty for the field. I mean formative in two senses of the word: formative as in a point of generation, as in generativity, and formative as in a point which determines what will follow or that which decides form. The matter of object or objectness, I argue, is a foundational site of disciplinary struggle, which creates the iconicity within this quotation. Let me explain this not. There is a mystification surrounding the creation of Fanon as an object through Blackness, wherein reading as a creative act masquerades as recognition. The phrase, "Look, a Negro," is a reading which is really a declarative or conjuring, bringing into being conceptually the thing that it purports to name. In other words, Blackness is created, not so much objectively discovered, when Fanon is cast symbolically as Blackness is representative through this statement. And then, this being object poses for Fanon a barrier to, quote, attaining to the source of the world. This translated phrase takes me to my project's point of intervention. Because the objectification of Blackness, even as an object of thought or idea, risks and has often equated to the objectification of actual people, there is a tension for anyone trying to think Blackness to take up Blackness as object of study, or to take up objects of study in a field defined thematically around Blackness. For the one racialized Black, this is compounded phenomenologically by the fact that the condition of anyone's being in the world and thinking are necessarily through a body, as an object among objects, regardless of race. Yet, one's being object as a point of being human versus one's being rendered object in the way Fanon expresses here creates an opposition. Hortense Spillers also explored this challenge for Black Studies scholarship in Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, a post-date about 2 decades ago. And Alex Wahalia then clarifies her point in that article singularly as, quote, instead of assuming that Black Studies reflects an already existent series of real objects, we need to draw attention to the complex ways this field of inquiry contributes to or articulates the creation of objects of knowledge, such as the Black community, Black culture, and indeed Black studies. Or else the field accepts too easily that race is a given natural and/or cultural phenomenon. Wahalia here gestures towards the discursivity of Blackness, the moment Blackness passes into the world from the unnamed interlocutor to Fanon through this intersubjective hail. My dissertation, titled Psychoanalytics Toward a Black Object Study, works within the tension specifically located at the junction between attaining to the source and Black objectness. I use psychoanalytic modes for thinking object to study African-American women's literature, to attain to the source of Blackness, if you will, or attend to it. To offer a theorization of Blackness's materialization as a meaningful object in the world through intersubjective processes of reading. Spillers also points out that the problem of object for Black studies is the empiricist concept of knowledge, which implies the transparency of reading. The hegemonic ideal of reading is proffering information to the reader about what is out there. It's part of the trouble. This fact makes Black feminist literary studies especially suited to the task of elaborating the ways in which the how of Blackness is being read, shapes the what, which Blackness then becomes. Focusing on how Blackness comes to meaning prior to the fact of any human body's existence, recall, Fanon only comes to find he is racistly objectified through this reading, not before, opens up new angles from which to learn about our objects. It also upholds one of the principles to which Black feminist inquiry dedicates itself, to insist that race is not an outgrowth of natural human difference, which is to insist on the ineffability of the person beyond her objectification as a racial and ideological symbol. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. These are amazing talks. And thank you, Paynter, for the introduction. In 1896, the French sociologist Émile Durkheim wrote that kinship is a social bond or it's nothing. Researchers who study the tremendous diversity of family forms around the world today still, by and large, find that statement to be true. We think that kinship is produced through social actions. Of course, in many parts of the world, blood ties are really important, but what that means is that people ascribe importance to a biological or genetic relationship. One of the ways people do that is through language. Language is thus generative of kinship. So particular kin terms, words like mother or cousin, or stepsister or godson, help to make a connection clear, audible, knowable to other people. During the time I'll be here this semester at Cogut Institute, I'll be analyzing a case study where kinship is being actively and deliberately produced ex nihilo. I'm working with an international NGO that provides what's called alternative care. UNICEF defines alternative care as support and rearing that's not provided by a child's, quote, own family. It's instead provided by some alternative to that. The NGO that I'm working with calls the kind of residential alternative care that they provide family-like. And by using that term, they're emphasizing, among other things, their commitment to affectionate, warm relationships as a critically valuable part of care provision. So already this idea of family-like care uses the word family to convey particular important qualities, behaviors, and actions. Another way that language use helps to produce kinship in this NGO is through the historic and persistent use of the kin term mother to describe the women who provide the children with trained professional care. For example, a press release by the Chilean office of the NGO describes the mothers as, quote, women who love, protect, guide, and educate boys and girls who didn't come from their wombs, but who represent for them the word motherhood in all its dimensions. The word mother in English is implicitly relational or reciprocal. By this, I mean that it's a kin term that implies a connection to another person, even without having that reciprocity built into the word itself. That is, a mother is the mother of her child. And this is certainly how many of the mothers working for the NGO think about the children that they've cared for over the years as meaningfully their children. So last year, when I visited one of the offices of this NGO in Latin America, one of the mothers shared that she had a son who had emigrated to Europe, a son who she had raised from infancy and even named. Because they are paid, because they are professionally trained, and because their children didn't, quote, come from their wombs, it might be tempting to represent these NGO mothers as what anthropologists used to call fictive kin. But there's a pretty convincing case to be made that it's not analytically useful to distinguish between kinship that's supposedly real and other kinship that is only fictional. That false distinction distracted from the way that all kinship is constituted through social action, including language. This case study that I'm working with, I believe, shows how, among other things, the very use of the kin term mother helps to make kinship and to make it real. Thank you.
Thank you both, Devon and Jessaca, for these glimpses into the workings of identity, belonging, and becoming. And now to conclude our event, we have two talks that investigate the question of borders and fences. Eleanor Paynter is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in Italian studies and at the Cogut Institute. She's working on a book titled Emergency in Transit, based on oral, written, and visual testimonies by African migrants in Italy. While focusing on contemporary issues of racial and climate justice, Eleanor's work also situates migrants within a longer cultural history of the figure of the farm worker in modern Italy. After Eleanor, we will hear Maru Attwood, who is an undergraduate concentrating in history. Maru is also part of a storytellers program at Brown, and she organizes for climate and housing justice. Maru's thesis traces a history of a rural region in South Africa, close to where she grew up, Her research focuses on the physical divisions of the land during apartheid and explores fences as points of interaction between people, the environment, and the state. Let's start with Eleanor.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who's here and to my colleagues at Cogut. This is a really great way to start the spring semester. So my work bridges critical refugee studies and transnational Italian studies, and in this work, I'm especially compelled by questions of migration, rights, and colonial memory in the contemporary Mediterranean, questions I see as directly related to histories of racial capitalism. I use narrative and ethnographic methods, and these orient my work, as you've just heard, around testimony and witnessing through oral history and through an engagement of a range of media and cultural texts. So the project that I'm currently focused on is called Uprooted: Migration, Farmworker Movements, and Contested Belonging in Italy's Changing Landscapes. And this was initially inspired by migrants I interviewed in Italy several years ago for the Emergency Project, who described how they were unable to escape a kind of precarity trap because the only work they could find was seasonal, uncontracted harvest labor that holds them in social and legal margins, and at the same time, how they were organizing to fight for rights recognition. So in Uprooted, I explore the pivotal role that migration and landless workers play in shaping notions of belonging through forms of rootedness and uprootedness. And I do this by focusing on the figure of the farm worker, or the bracciante, in modern Italy. A lot of work on migration in Italy centers urban spaces or Italy's external borders, like Lampedusa, for instance. By shifting the focus to rural environments, I situate today's migrant farm workers not only within contemporary migration dynamics, but within a longer transnational history where, since Italy's 1861 unification, landless workers have repeatedly organized for rights and for change. Today, foreigners comprise at least 1/3 of Italy's agricultural labor force, and that number is much higher in southern regions. Many of these workers confront corruption and exploitation in the sector, so underpaid and uncontracted work, as well as the prevalence of organized crime. These situations are not new, but they've continued and have morphed with shifting migration trends. So as fewer Italians have worked as braccianti and more workers come from Eastern Europe and now increasingly from South Asia and from Africa. In popular imaginaries, farm workers move between hypervisibility and invisibility. With this in mind, I'm thinking in this project of the farm worker as a gendered, racialized, and migratory figure, a figure that's as significant as it is marginalized, and also about farm workers as actual workers laboring at the intersections of multiple social and environmental issues. These workers, I argue, are importantly connected to questions of mobility and citizenship. Their relationship to land and to related ideas of rights and belonging is complex in part because their work keeps them mobile. In Italy, this includes historically Southern peasants who moved internally, Italians who moved abroad as settler farmers in the colonies or planters in the Americas, and migrants today whose legal and social precarity keeps them working in slave-like conditions. Bracciante labor and movements have continually produced Italian landscapes and played a crucial role in the making of Italy. So to trace workers' connections to land across these histories, I'm looking at historical records, film and media, and the words of braccianti themselves in life writing and through interviews. I'm interested in what resonances and frictions across different episodes can tell us about shifting ideas of citizenship and belonging. For instance, the relationship that Italians who cultivated the Libyan desert during fascism had to land and to notions of foreignness, indigeneity, and sovereignty, and what we learn when holding that up next to the ways that today's African farm workers view their relationship to Italian soil as they harvest tomatoes, and how they're organizing around what they see as interconnected issues of worker rights, racial justice, and sustainability. One of my goals with this project is to elaborate how two contemporary phenomena fit within this longer history. So first, how the racialization of migration meets the refugeization of labor, or the increasing reliance on a precarious workforce that's comprised of asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented workers. And second, how these landscapes continue to change. Uprootedness is newly consequential in a moment when some migrants have fled the consequences of climate change, only to find themselves harvesting crops where, as one advocate in Sicily told me, producers are unsure how long they'll be able to cultivate. How do these dynamics fit within broader understandings of labor, changing landscapes, and their intimate ties to ideas of the citizen? I look forward to continuing to work on these and related questions this semester. Thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. It's been so good to hear about you, how you're thinking about your projects this evening. So my name is Maru Attwood, and I'm an undergraduate fellow and a history concentrator. So my project explores the history of fences and paths as points of environmental interaction in rural South Africa. I look at the ways that environmental agents such as cattle, colonial officials, antelope, African herders, white farmers, lions, and diseases all interacted around these points. I focus in on a region in the northeast of the country known as Nsikazi, and about which little academic history is written. So Nsikazi was this thin fragment of land that during colonialism was segregated as an area where Black people could live, though they could not own land. And it lies between the Kruger National Park, this massive world-famous conservation area on one side, and on the other, it's bordered by this expanse of large privately owned farms and towns, which during apartheid were owned exclusively by white people, and is also the area where I, as a white South African, grew up. So to research this history, I brought material that I found in a number of archives in South Africa, together with oral histories that I collected over 3 months working with people in and around Nsikazi. And in this developing reciprocity with oral history narrators that I worked with by sharing historical material like archival records and historical aerial images that I've gained access to through my research has been a really important part of this project. I'm researching this topic out of a deep curiosity about and responsibility that I feel towards the land that I grew up on and am connected to through histories of colonialism. I'm also working out of a recognition of the ways that engagement with local histories really matter. And to this end, I'm creating an illustrated account of some of the narratives that I found in this history with the goal to continue to engage people in and around the Nsikazi area about the ways that about their histories and the ways that they're represented. So through this project, I'm tracing the history of relationships with the environment from before the late 19th century, when there were scattered settlements and relatively loose social and physical boundaries, a point in time in which there was no need for tight spatial and territorial divisions. And I trace this history through colonial land dispossession and the earliest introductions of barbed wire until the late 1960s at the height of apartheid-era segregation and environmental exclusion. And so this project really culminates in the period in which fencing becomes systematic within and on the borders of Nsikazi. And I'm looking at how fences and paths become sites of environmental interaction and contestation that various actors respond to in often surprising ways. So barbed wire, for instance, as one might expect, became a tool for the state to restrict Black people's access to land, water, animals, and other aspects of the environment. But the residents of Nsikazi also used barbed wire to extend the land that they had access to. They cut up fences and that white farmers erected over their footpaths, and sometimes they bundled those up to erect around their own fields and homes. When the Kruger National Park was fenced, many people and animals found ways around, through, and over the fence to continue accessing resources and the environment on the other side. Some, like lions, learned to hunt antelope by trapping them against the fence, and others, like elephants, simply smashed fences down to eat crops grown by people on the other side. But in my oral history testimonies, I found that the presence or absence of fences was not necessarily a case of clear-cut human-wildlife conflict. In some instances, people in Nsikazi intentionally avoided putting up fences around their fields and invited animals like reedbuck in to eat part of their crops with the understanding that this would make their harvests more abundant. So my project is concerned with localized mobility, the ways in which people and animals collectively created footpaths through the veldt, and the ways that this mobility concerned and threatened the colonial state. I argue that historical footpaths and boundaries are representations of complex and illegible local realities and relationships to space, ones that the settler colonial state sought to render legible and control. So the histories that I'm exploring have strong reverberations and continuities into the present. where many of the spatial, environmental, and economic inequalities of apartheid persist, and where over my lifetime in post-apartheid South Africa, fences and boundary walls have grown more restrictive, more ubiquitous, and more militarized.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Maru. Thank you so much, everyone. This is such a rich array of projects, and I really very much look forward to seeing them evolve, actually, in conversation also during our seminar throughout the spring. Videos of this evening's talks will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, where you can also find videos from previous editions of Meet the Fellows. The Cogut Institute has also exciting events coming up soon. You can find them on our website. The link is being posted right now, I believe, in the chat. There is the film thinking series with the screening of The Cow, an Iranian film from 1969, followed by a roundtable discussion on the film. There is a talk by Indian writer Amitav Ghosh, drawing from his recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse. There is another talk by Diana Paulin from Trinity College on Blackness, autism, and the neurocolor line. And there is the 2 days Political Concepts Conference, the title of which is for this year's edition, This World. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We hope to see you soon at the Cogut Institute's events. Thank you.